It's a real pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Lucia Fuselli. Lucia is a an energy and sustainability expert. She has over 15 years of experience in clean energy decarbonization, climate finance, ESG, and adaptation. She has worked with policymakers in international organizations such as the World Economic Forum, development banks such as the European Investment Bank, and consultancies to shape sustainable infrastructure portfolios and advise on strategic projects across Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia Pacific. Lucia has been acting as the energy lead in the Green Climate Fund, and prior to that, as program officer for the Energy Material and Infrastructure Platform for the World Economic Forum. She is an expert advisor for the EU Commission Innovation Fund and co-lead of the UNESCO Green Climate Finance Working Group, working on establishing principles for the climate financing of green grids. She is also a founder and board member of Climate Strategies Consulting, a firm dedicated to advising governments, organizations, and businesses on matters related to decarbonization, mitigation, and adaptation. She has earned an MSc in finance from the London Business School. She has an MBA from Warwick University and an MSc in civil and environmental engineering from UNI BPM in Italy. Lucia is going to talk to us today about what's currently happening in international climate finance.
Screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, where we are with international climate finance. If we look at the global climate finance infrastructure, this is interlaced with the concessional finance, with the multilateral finance infrastructure. The core climate finance agencies in reality are only 5. We then have multilateral lenders, which in time will become climate financiers. At the moment, they have a percentage of their investments in climate finance, earmarked as climate finance. We have a number of bilateral agencies, of course, and we are increasingly seeing, as you know, climate finance become a desirable asset class. We are increasingly seeing new entrants, especially sovereign climate funds. We have an example with the Emirates Mubadala, which is a sovereign wealth fund and operates through Masdar, which is his operating arm for renewable energy investment, for example, which is climate mitigation, of course, but still within climate finance. Philanthropies, Climate Works being a notable example, and also private finance now emerging. So we have a few dedicated funds, dedicated to climate finance. One example for COP28, very famous, is Alterra, newly established, but there are, of course, others. This said, the climate finance needs, they sum up to around 6 trillion a year to 2030 and 7 trillion to 2050. Against the public climate finance currently deployed, so everything that has been deployed so far, amounting to 1.2 trillion in 2022, of which adaptation finance is less than 10%. So the situation is pretty dire, especially for what concerns adaptation finance. Emerging and developing economy, and of course, the most exposed to climate change, and there the adaptation finance need are around 130, between 130 and 415 billion a year to 2030. So it's a huge amount if compared to what has been done so far, and it needs massive scale up. If we look at the core climate finance institutions, so the five that I mentioned before, in total, so far, so since they're established, they have deployed 277 billion I remind you that the needs are in the order of trillions. So indeed, there needs to be a massive scale up. Of these, the largest one, the Green Climate Fund, so far has deployed 13.9 billion. Climate Investment Fund, most of these are focused on also on the global south. So either vulnerable countries or emerging and developing economies or transition economy. Global Environment Facility, each of them with a slightly different focus. Most of them operating through accredited entities, so not open to just everybody to submit proposals. The biggest deployment is for the Global Environment Facility, which is also the oldest one. However, it finances around 1,600 projects. So if you look at the unit investment, it's very small. And only the Green Climate Fund and the GEF monitor the breakdown between adaptation and mitigation. And as you can see, they strive to 50-50%, but they don't manage to. Even in the GCF, who is particularly careful to this, adaptation sums up to 45%. The only fund that is truly dedicated and fully dedicated to adaptation is the one who deployed actually the least in all its life cycle, and it's grant based only. $1 billion only on 175 projects. That gives you an idea not only of the adaptation needs, but really how much is dedicated to adaptation on specialized lending. So on top of that, there is no dedicated climate finance facility for developed economy. So adaptation in developed economies potentially financeable through private sector, fine, but remains to be seen and is currently not mapped how much private sector is doing on adaptation. And so adaptation finance fundamentally is underserved in both emerging and developing economies and in developed countries. Now, if we look at the scope of adaptation finance, we see that there are several themes that are somehow interlacing. Productive activities, so agriculture, food security, forest and land use. When I say food security, I mean also fisheries, for example, not necessarily only agriculture. In general, whatever concerns ecosystem and resources, water, for example. And then there is the resilience aspect, which is a kind of a subsector of adaptation. Resilience of infrastructure and resilience of cities. These are the themes. Now, the how, so what are the technology solution? Here we have a range spanning, as I'm sure you know, spanning between nature-based solution, regenerative solution, especially for forest and natural ecosystem, and resilience planning. So designing for resilience, designing infrastructure, designing cities or retrofitting for resilience. And together with the project, there needs to be a look on the enabling context. And therefore, we have policies, standards, which at the moment are lacking, and early warning system. Because how do we ensure resilience is also being able to forecast climate hazards, being able to have an outlook of what's going to happen in the future and program the resilience action. So early warning system in climate finance become particularly important, also because measuring climate performance is about also having those data. And if you don't have monitoring system and an early warning system, you risk you don't have those data. A few successful mechanisms, as I'm sure you all know or have kind of heard about. Result-based payments or payment for ecosystem services, for example, utilized for sustainable agriculture practices, sustainable aquaculture practices, or reforestation. These are local level. So one example is like mangrove management and sustainable, I don't know, shrimp breeding practices, community-based. Public social-private partnership, this is particularly successful, for example, on marine parks. So when you have a revenue-generating activity combined with the natural ecosystem facility that you're trying to restore. We have weather index insurance. So insurance against, let's say, climate disasters provided in exchange to future offtake of the product. Dedicated private equity funds. An example is GCF Global Fund for Coral Reefs. So this is really private equity offer and targeting earmark for sustainable activities, sustainable ocean production, ecotourism, sustainable waste management, or growth funds, growth equity, like a sort of venture capital provided for resilience technologies. Technologies enabled increasing resilience of the system. And in these cases, we can see co-financing with philanthropies. And this is something that, going beyond grant is a theme in adaptation finance, which is now, all the efforts are aimed to bring forward, because of course is recognized with grants alone, it's not possible to scale up. And private equity seems to be quite a nice solution, because of course it includes it attracts private investments. And then loans for sustainable production. That implies revenue generating activity, of course, agroforestry, forest land restoration, coastal restoration, or marine parks. Now, so the scope is more or less clear. Successful mechanisms do exist. However, if we look at an IISD study in 2021, that clarifies also that adaptation strategy, it's not sufficient to prioritize the project, it's not sufficient to costing the adaptation access. It's not necessarily more effective than building national awareness and political buy-in. That means you can have the mechanism, you can have the scope, but if you don't have the enabling policies, that doesn't take place, because there is not the catalytic effect that prompts to action. Also, greater emphasis is needed in improving the enabling environment and attracting private sector investments. And policies are also, we know from other, let's say, aspects of finance, policy is also conducive to that. And indeed, the enabling environment sometimes is simply not there. So if we look at the challenges and what needs to be done, and especially looking at an angle, like looking at a policy angle, what we see as a few challenges. First of all, beyond the national adaptation plan, for the countries that do have a national adaptation planning, there is the void. There are some spot policies, but there is not a coordinated programmatic action of countries. And even if we look at the NAPs, 58 countries have submitted the national adaptation plan, and other 48 are to submit before 2027. So all that you see blank in that map is countries that haven't submitted, that don't have a national adaptation plan. And there's quite a bunch of both developing and developing world. So lack of policies, actuation policies. So lack of regulation. Then there is also lack of pipeline and prioritization. So adaptation planning identifies macro areas in general, like national adaptation plan, they identify macro areas, macro priorities, so themes, but do not necessarily list down projects. So there needs to be the next step. And then again, importance of the enabling context and scarce attention to that. Incentive and mechanism. Some of them do exist, but they are not mainstream. And the stakeholders' involvement is also not systematized. So sometimes policies are top-down. They don't really look at the local aspects. And this for adaptation is even more important, because there needs to be an awareness of the local condition and the local disasters happening and the local climate hazard in order to formulate, in order to draft an enabling context that is sound. There's no silver bullet there. And then another two aspect is, okay, how to quantify resilience and adaptation. At the moment, there is no harmonized or national view. so it is also difficult for actors to do cost-benefit analysis or to identify the ROE, the return of investment of prevention. How much return on investment, how much savings, how much socioeconomic benefits I have from building resilience by design. How much return of investment I have on adapted ecosystem. I mean, financial mechanisms do exist, but then quantifying the ROI for adaptation project is notoriously very difficult. And one reason is, no harmonized or national view exists on quantifying this. So it's also difficult if you want to structure outcome-based finance or even risk management solution, there is a lack of data. Because there is a lack of ways to manage data, agreed ways to manage data. And of course, I mean, institutional and financial capacity is lacking, not necessarily at the national level, but at the local level. And again, we are saying, local level is important here. How do we approach that from a policy perspective? There needs to be kind of a holistic look, in my opinion. So, for example, okay, there are after the national adaptation planning, there needs to be, this national adaptation planning needs to be followed up by an adaptation and resilience program. You have the generation sector planning, you have the transmission and distribution sector planning that identify a number of areas, grids, zone. Why there is not an adaptation and resilience sector planning? Looking at, for example, as priorities, critical infrastructure, because it's the one that when goes down causes the most damage, socioeconomic and not. And then ecosystem-based activities, because those are the revenue-generating activities. So that's where the economic damage is higher. Now, once the program has been identified, so like what we want to do based on the themes of the national adaptation planning, then there needs to be a discussion on national sectoral indicators for resilience and adaptation, but also to quantify climate hazard. So risk multiplied by impact, risk, vulnerability, and likelihood, and then impact, how much money is going to cost if the climate disaster strikes. Once there are these two, then there could be a pipeline. These two are enabling a pipeline identification, because once identified the critical infrastructure and the ecosystem-based activities, then it's possible to do a pipeline identification based on success cases. That means the question that needs to be asked there is, which are the areas and ecosystem in my region that are identified as priorities as for the programs, and where success cases can be replicated. In this way, there is kind of an intersection of what is possible to do, easy, low-hanging fruit, and what is programmatic to do. And the rest, the rest as a second priority because it's less immediately identifiable. And then, as we said, the local dimension in adaptation counts. So enabling policies should be local, ideally, like, regional, because what you have, the situation you have in Louisiana is not the situation that you have in California, fundamentally. So at the state level, but potentially even, for big cities, even at the city level. The underpinning question is what to support and what to require. As we know, there can be positive incentivizing policies and negative policies based on requirement. So it's like you on one side you incentivize, on the other side you enforce, and these two needs to be balanced. So what to support is for the positive policies, what to require is for the enforcing. Positive policies include fiscal incentives for adaptation, public utility pricing, tax reliefs for investment in adaptation, or incentives for demo projects that utilize resilient technologies or adaptation technologies or mechanisms. Enforcement, public procurement requirements. A lot of these projects in general, large infrastructure project or even adaptation project are public or have a participation of public. So how about embedding requirements into public procurement? Pretty much what should be done for green products, but this is transposed into adaptation and resilience. Resilience standard in infrastructure, planning obligations for the municipalities, for example, if they don't exist already. Now, pipeline identification and identification of policies that will require local stakeholders engagement in order for these two not to be top down, but also to have to understand whether the monitor infrastructure is appropriate or if it needs enhancement. Monitor infrastructure and early warning system. After having identified the policies, then how the policies can help financing, especially local financiers, because they are the ones that are less prepared, that have less capacity. I mean, at the national, like federal level, it's easier to summon international financial institutions or the likes. But local financing actor might not have that firepower and might not have that level of competence. So how policies can facilitate local financing actors? Also because we don't have only to think about the big infrastructure, we also have to think about SMEs. Adaptation needs to, involve the entire economic fabric, and SMEs risk to be much more impacted and less able to defend. So definitely that's something that attention to local financing actors is something that needs to be there. And similarly, at the local level and in concert with the stakeholder, policies for building up capacity. Once identifying the capacity gap, okay, how can I, as a policymaker, maybe set up a program for capacity building, for awareness raising. And that's where, instead of, let's say, loan or private equity or financial product, that's where capacity building, that's where grants and programs and potentially philanthropies, because they are the ones that are really working with grants, could be really useful. Because they will have catalytic effect in a way that other programs might, other financial products might not have. And it's all from my side. Over.
Thank you so much, Lucia. I've seen, I think we have 20 entries into the chat, so we have a lot to talk about. But I'd like to talk about briefly what you and I are doing, particularly for the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and Professionals, in diving deep into, why these climate multilateral large climate funds are not being utilized more, searching for the real answers. And we've interviewed several funds, we've interviewed PPP units, we've spoken to climate related agencies. And the one thing that I see, and I'd like your comments on this, is one of the main issues is lack of understanding, lack of communication between these various actors that is prohibiting some utilization of these funds, just simply because people don't have a clear understanding, as you said, of the policies that these funds often have that must be followed. But what else do you see, Lucia, in this as we move forward with this research?
Pardon? Sorry. It kind of broke down the last the line.
Oh, I just asked what do you see?
Yeah.
As we go through this research project, what do you see that stands out to you as far as the reasons that these aren't being utilized more?
The reasons that
they're not being utilized more.
Okay, in some cases, it's a bit like also the structure and the size of the funds. There is, if we compare the size of these funds with the multilateral lenders, this is quite tiny, and that creates issues in in systematizing, but also in defining what are the priorities. And it creates also the obligation somehow to piggyback on subjects that have bigger firepower, like IFIs. Secondly, funds, they tend to work with accredited entities, and that's accreditation. It's a process that can take 1 year.
Right.
Allora, 1 year plus a gestation project, a gestation process for the project that takes in the order of 2 years at best. That makes it very time consuming and also very capital consuming for subjects that not necessarily have the time or the resources to wait this long.
Right.
So I think it's a bit on the infrastructure of the funds. Then there are some idiosyncratic risk, especially for the global south, that might not necessarily be there for developed economies, such as the usual suspect, like perceived country risk, currency risks, and so on and so forth, which of course exacerbate the bankability issue.
Right.
And in general, climate finance so far has been a niche. Adaptation finance, an even smaller one. There is also, at the moment, not quite a clear understanding of how this interacts with ESG requirements. ESG is something that has been characterizing the private sector finance. And there are several protocols also there. There is not a unified vision. The greening of portfolios, it has started, but I think it still lacks coordination with the climate finance that there is out there. So once that coordination will be reached, probably that barrier will be overcome, and that will facilitate attraction of private investment because there will be, increased demand, and also scale up of climate finance. So I
I
think
couldn't agree with you
these are
more.
conditions. And then for adaptation finance specifically, return on investments are kind of perceived as low, but that's because there is no quantification of there's no, I mean, it's difficult to do CBA. There's no monetization of the advantages of adaptation or resilience.
Right.
And that hasn't quite reached the private financiers yet.
Right. That's a big problem, a big
Yeah.
issue. And we're all aware of that here. There's a couple of great comments and questions in the chat. So I'm going to take a stab at that. Let me see who this is first. David, I'm having trouble with mine. There we are. David Sarasi says on climate hazard indicators, I would love to see a way to capture before and after. So status quo is risk impact, but we also calculate the delta when we adjust for adaptive capacity after the introduction of a new or restored intervention. That's something, David, that we are all very much would love to see. How can we quantify the benefits of climate adaptation in dollar terms? Because Lucia just said it. You don't have a mechanism for return in adaptation the way you do in many mitigation projects, a solar panel installation, a wind power installation. Lucia's an authority at clean energy. And many of those, although not all of them, do have a positive cash flow. So that justifies an investment. We're working on that, several of us in ASAP. And then Stephen Mack says, suppose we had a way to quantify resilience and adaptation at the national level. Didn't she just say that while plans are important, political buy-in and funded adaptation efforts are more important for actual action? And so one measures but still doesn't get action? Question mark. I think that's an issue again that we all are trying to get our hands around. Says that we've seen over and over that international goals and objectives at international climate change conferences haven't been acted on nationally. So how does measurement help? And as she just said, the local and regional efforts are more ideal. success cases are great and should be evaluated, but are they transferable to other nations and contexts? Lucia, how would you take a stab at that question about transferability or replicability of these interventions?
So I guess success cases, one needs to look at success cases in terms of the mechanism and in terms of the kind of socioeconomic background. So mechanism could be potentially replicable. And the socioeconomic background that will need to be kind of adapted and evaluated utilized for the evaluation of the suitability. Probably financial mechanism could be tailored to match the scale because, of course, in a developed country, a sustainable agricultural operation is not going to have this. It's going to have probably a bigger scale than in the countries in the country in the global south. For example, for economy revenue generating activities, I think there is a bit more transferability. Of course, what needs to be looked at is also the regulatory framework of the countries that might be different or conductive of certain type of financial mechanism rather than other. And if I may also make a few comments on the previous question. On David Savare's question, status quo is risk multiplied by impact. When adjusting for adaptive capacity, so after the project, the impact of the disaster should be lower. And there might be, that will need a study to predict what the impact could be, how the lower the impact could be. But that's what drives monetization fundamentally.
Right.
Also, yes, political buy-in is important. One measure, but still doesn't get action. Measures help monetization and help transferability potentially. But buy-in is what starts the action.
Yeah.
So they are both important, although political buy-in is really what catalyzes. You can have the measures, yes, but if you don't have the driver, there still might be resistance to change, as it happened before for climate mitigation.
Right, exactly. Stephen asked another great question. Isn't financing local actions done at the national level and not at the international level, except for individual projects that try out new ideas? If the national political buy-in isn't there, why does one expect more financing of local actions and actors? I think that's a great point because, again, in the U.S., the most developed country, we say, well, we can do that nationally. But I think, Lucia, you would agree that in developing countries, in the global south in particular, there often aren't national capacity. And that's why these international funds are tapped because of the capacity isn't at the national level. Would that be correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in developed countries, there still could be financing of local action and local actors, provided there is like local political interest of making this happen. In some developed countries, there is also the regulation by which certain programmatic action or certain planning is delegated at regional level or at city level or at local level. Now, those subjects have the capacity of creating localized policy incentives if there is buy-in at that level. And to work with commercial finance, for example, at that specific level to exert change.
Yeah, exactly. He goes on to say hazard management is needed, but always retroactive. For resilience and adaptation, one really needs proactive efforts, preparation, and developing trust before the emergency and disaster happens. Otherwise, one is just always reacting. I think you and I could both agree wholeheartedly with that statement. My friend Honora Burris says, more quality of life. This is a great statement, Honora. Many quality of life improvement actions that are critical to resilience are very difficult to measure in monetary fashion or any other quantitative metrics. What's your thought about that, Lucia? About things that are inherently beneficial to social and societal, but
Yeah.
may be difficult to measure.
I think there needs to be an effort in increasing the statistics. I mean,
Yeah,
if you can't measure in monetary fashion, you have to research literature to see if there are proxies, and you use those.
yeah,
Or you look at statistics and you try to derive some conclusion from those. This is also a bit of a call to action, really at the national level, but for national, at the United States, at the federal, what you would call at the federal level,
right.
to increase the measurements and monitoring capacity of certain parameters, really.
Yeah, yeah,
Because that also
absolutely.
could help, let's say, climate metrics and life improvement metrics as well. We measure the GDP, but we don't measure the quality of life with the same kind of accuracy.
Yeah, and that's an issue that a lot of us here at ASAP have talked about, and we do have a couple of our working groups that are looking at those issues. Does anyone else have a question? You can unmute yourself and ask it. Anyone?
Hey,
Either we
David.
just, oh, go ahead. Hey, Angie, go ahead.
Hey, I threw one in the chat and I just thought I would raise it up here. What you're talking about in this slide really resonates. I can't tell if I feel validated or terrified that the whole world is dealing with the same issues we're dealing with in California. But we have the same issues with funding access and trying to get the right dollars to the right places among all the capital options that are available. And I'm wondering what you're seeing from a global perspective, if you're seeing anybody solve it. What would an administrative vehicle look like anywhere that would organize all of these the marketplace of all of these capital options alongside of the capacity support that is needed in local areas to get the project scoped into a pipeline, ultimately funded, ideally first by public dollars, last by financing, and done. So that's what we're trying to figure out here in California. It blows my mind to think of it on a global scale, but I'd love to hear examples.
The thing is, if you want my opinion, that would that would need the coordination on a few ministries or some sort of authority that is able to set up a dialogue with the various ministries and then look at the downstream and coordinate the downstream. Now, at the moment, I mean, the only authority is whomever drafts the national adaptation plans in country. And even there, we know that most of these adaptation plans require technical assistance to be drafted. What does it mean? That the capacity there does not exist. Probably in developed countries, situation is different because there is that expertise, but there is not still the institution that is able to coordinate and carry forward that dialogue. But that dialogue is needed. And at a certain point, something like an institution or a unit, or the same way for PPP, you have PPP units. How about having something that resembles an adaptation unit or adaptation and resilient unit? Call it as you like. And I mean, this could be at the federal level, or it could be at a state level. But that could help potentially coordinate those efforts.
I missed it. You said after PPP, I couldn't hear it very well. So tell me what.
I said the same way that you have PPP units for public-private partnership.
Oh,
the same way you could have like an adaptation and resilience unit, like an entity that has the expertise to set up the dialogue with financiers, and that could be at the federal level or it could be at the state level, depending.
Imagine, Angie, that FEMA said, okay, we're going to establish a parallel agency that is for climate adaptation and resilience, and we're going to help each state do that as well. Imagine what that would do. Now, it may not work well because we've tried so many different things, and ironically, everyone, United States is the only developed country that does not have a PPP agency, public-private partnership agency. And public-private partnerships could play a big role in helping us further adaptation. Any other questions? We're getting close on time. Anne, do you want to say anything in closing?
Well, maybe before we, could I follow up on that, just one thing, David?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Because I feel like an angel has sent the speaker in California. We are.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Angie.
You're the angel.
I'm the
David.
one that stuck my neck out and said we need Lucia to talk. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, so one thing we're doing is we built something called the State and Local Energy and Climate Coordination. It's like initiative. And it's because of exactly what you're talking about. And it's us as a nonprofit entity partnering up with 9 different state agencies that do energy and climate to try to help them coordinate and then help them talk to us directly, have this two-way conversation, and ideally setting up these regional hubs where we can actually funnel down actual contracts for technical assistance to have lasting support for capacity to, scope projects into what will eventually be, we hope, a climate funding queue. So I just feel like it's what you're talking about. And I would love to, if you have more details on what you would be recommending, I would love to see it because I'm looking for precedents.
Yeah. I mean, if there are other examples or precedents, I'll have to do a bit of research to ascertain that. But I think the fact that it's an NGO is actually a demonstration of the fact that when the institution don't think about it, when the top down doesn't think about it, is the bottom up that's come with it. And maybe in time, this could evolve into something else, into a more like institutionalized form. So it's good that that's already in place. And I'm sure if someone does a bit of research, there might be similar bottom-up initiatives, maybe named in a different way, etc. But they are trying to achieve kind of the same thing. And there are opportunities potentially to connect these NGOs of this type to technical, I mean, for them to start to funding, for them to start doing technical assistance in more or less the same way that the Global Center of Adaptation does. Okay, the Global Center of Adaptation itself is an NGO. It's headquartered in the Netherlands. Okay, it operates at an international level, so it might be more general purpose, mostly works with climate financiers. But then if you transpose that aspect to the more local or regional level, you obtain exactly what you have.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think bottom up's going to be a lasting solution. The only reason we're getting anywhere is we have state agencies bought in.
Yeah.
Eventually leading it. And I feel like that authority is key.
Yeah. There needs to be some sort of advocacy action and a research whether similar solutions there are across the United States, for example, to see if there can be some sort of aggregation and then lobbying for something at the institutional level.
Yeah, I think coordination is probably the missing ingredient for us here in the U.S. There's not a lot of coordination, and of course, ASAP, is really taking a stand at that role, and I hope we can continue with that. Thank Thank you, Angie. That's been great. Anyone else?
For some of us really down in that climate, the niche, the sub niche, we're all watching California and TCFD to see how it goes down.
Yeah.
Right? Because like my argument's like, hey, we can think with a wider aperture and talk about cost avoidance and talk about, you know, like minimal interventions that create these 100-to-1 returns and mitigation. But people won't listen to those maths until we can prove like the ESG
Yeah,
decarbonization.
which in of itself, as you know, Steve, is becoming increasingly politicized, unfortunately, here. But yeah, I think you're right. Any other comments? Any other questions? And you want to wrap us up? Anything you'd like to say?
Thanks everyone for a really engaged discussion, both in the chat and over the video screens. It was great to see everyone. And Lucia, thanks so much for spending the time with us during your later evening. Really appreciate